I started Immunetics in Boston a number of years ago, and I've used SBIR grants to support much of the R&D work and product development work that we've done over the years, mostly in the area of diagnostic assays for infectious diseases. So while I'm going to concentrate, let's say my examples tonight are drawn pretty much from that area, diagnostic assays, infectious pathogens, that kind of area. I think the principles are fairly general, and I think they apply more or less across the board. So bear with me with my examples. I'm sure they're not in everyone's field by any means, but I'll try to get to the point and make them as intelligible as I can. So let's see if I can move this thing forwards. Disclaimers. This is mainly about NIH SBIR grants. There are, as you probably know, SBIRs from other agencies, DOD, CDC, FDA, you name it. But I've spent most of my effort has been with NIH. You can get all the hard facts direct from NIH and multiple other sources. So I didn't really come here to reel off all the facts you can get online or by reading multiple sources. I really came here to give you some, let's say, opinions and my interpretations of what makes for good SBIR grants and more successful SBIR applications. And I've seen this from both ends, because in addition to writing grant applications, I've been a reviewer on study sections for NIH numerous times, and so I see it that way too, which is to me very helpful, and I'm going to try to convey some of the sense of what it's like being a reviewer, so that hopefully you can take that in as you're writing a grant, and it can be helpful. So for one, it turned out when I started looking around that I would have trouble being very original in this genre, given that the world is plastered with books and pamphlets and whatever on how to be a successful grant writer. And you can choose any one of these, and they're probably pretty good. I actually found one which I liked, which has been highly reputed, which I'll mention at the end. But certainly there's no lack of information and opinions and whatever on how to write good grants. So I'm just one little piece. My opinion is just my own. There's a lot out there. Next, I thought, in the spirit of Stephen Hawking, I'd run you through a brief history of grant writing just to sort of set the stage. Okay, so grant writing started a long time ago when tools for grant writing were very primitive, and you can see that the surviving fragment of the world's first grant, it's a fairly simple grant application, and that's what happened to the unsuccessful applicant at the time. As time moved on, people became more sophisticated in their writing capabilities, and eventually, we got to the point where the modern era commences. And the good and the bad point of this is that, yes, you can write a grant application on a laptop sitting by the beach. The bad news is that you can never take a vacation. That's what I found out at any rate. So what should you get out of the workshop? Hopefully understand something about what reviewers are looking for, what they reward or penalize in an application, building blocks to improve your odds of success in funding, efficient organization to produce SBIR applications on time, and more successful outcomes in funding than this guy, Dr. Evil, who I don't think he benefited from SBIR programs. So we've already gone through this. Alice asked the question, how many people have written one? And the only other thing I wanted to mention here is that the thing about grant applications is that they go to committees to be reviewed, and really the worst way to get anything done is to give it to a committee. So that's part of what we have to deal with, the reality here. The next reality is, what is the government actually looking for? And what they're looking for is improvement in healthcare through some kind of new products. They're looking for economic stimulus. They're looking for technology leadership, et cetera. Individual agencies have their own priorities, and you can find out what those priorities are by going to their websites or talking with their program officers. And that can be very helpful to do And of course, SBIR applications are aimed at producing real-world tangible products, and so you have to really aim at something real and tangible rather than just technology development, which is more of a non-SBIR grant activity. So you have to address all these things. A grant application is a combination of science and written communication. It's not purely one or the other, but it can succeed or fail based on one or the other component. And it's a psychological game in the end that you play against a team of reviewers and against many competitors. And that's sort of the way that I view it here. The trend we're up against is that the level of funding, over time, there was a peak at whatever year it is, looks like 2005 or something. And then, of course, the budget started dropping. And so now in 2014, we're well below where the NIH funding level ought to be, at least ought to in my view, and in many people's views. So it has become progressively harder and harder as the NIH budget has taken a hit. Number of grants funded has declined. It's become harder and harder to get any kind of grants. So more grants chasing less funding. There are more grants constantly being recirculated. That's the environment that we're all in, me too. With that, there are perhaps more opportunities, more different mechanisms of getting funding than there used to be. SBIR grants are sort of the mainstay, most of what I'll talk about. Phase 1 and Phase 2, you probably know the difference there. So for an SBIR Phase 1 or Phase 2 grant, you've got 3 application deadlines a year. That's nice because every 4 months you can be writing a new grant. There are also SBIR contracts with Phase 1 and Phase 2. These are not nearly as well known or disseminated as the grants, and they have a once-a-year deadline, but that can be a very successful mechanism for getting funding.
Andy? Andy,
yes.
Just a quick question. These are NIH deadlines that you're talking about, right?
Yes, that's true. I don't know if there are non-NIH deadlines that are different. Obviously, you could find out from the agency websites. So let's say if you don't see anything otherwise on the slides, assume that it's an NIH-specific bit of data information. But the contract deadline is once a year in the fall. There are generic grant and contract guidelines or solicitations for SBIRs. There are also specific RFAs that NIH agencies publish from time to time, and a specific RFA means for a specific topic. So if you happen to be in that field, that can be a good way to go to aim an application at that topic, because you'll have probably much less competition for money which is committed to that topic. And now a new thing within the past few weeks is direct Phase 2 grants, which NIH has just published, where if you have adequate preliminary data, you can go direct to a Phase 2 grant, which will pay you more money than a typical Phase 1 grant.
Can you kind of tell us the difference between the grant versus the contract?
Yes, I'm going to do that on this slide. Timely. So grants versus contracts. We've been through the due dates here. The Phase 1, Phase 2 is about the same. Application procedure for grants, very efficient. We have electronic grant submission. Contracts tends to be much more time-consuming in the amount of paperwork you have to generate. Very important, though, is the specific deliverables for a grant are up to you. It's basically you proposing your thing, whatever it is, your topic. Whereas for a contract, usually the government has an idea of what they want. They have specific deliverables that they want, and they're looking for someone who can fulfill them. So that means that, again, the pool of applicants might be much larger for grants than for contract solicitations. And so a contract in your area you might have a good shot at. The administrative burden for grants, it is what it is. I call it moderate. But for contracts, it's a lot more. It's a lot of administration we find. The reporting burden is much larger for contracts. Flexibility tends to be much less for contracts in terms of what you can and can't do. NIH tends to be more involved in your daily life, which can be not the most pleasant. But as I mentioned, targeted topics, most of the grants are not targeted. Contracts are targeted, and that's what gives you the ability for playing in a very focused competition for a contract. So higher chance of funding if you happen to have the expertise in that specific area. And that is something that is worth thinking about. If a contract opportunity comes along, you can read the, go back there, you can read the contract solicitation when it's published. Again, the NIH websites publish the contract solicitations probably in the summer. And you can go down the list of topics, and if you find one in your area, then that's what you can focus on. If there's nothing in your area, maybe it's not the right thing. So logistics of grant writing, less pain with good management. And so you need a dependable team. Some tough people, basically. You also have a timeline which is not very flexible. So that's what that's what you're up against, more or less. And on your submission team, let's say, I'm saying team because that's the ideal situation. Ideally, you want somebody to manage your timeline and organize individual contributors. You want somebody to write the scientific content. All this stuff is happening. Someone to develop and write the non-scientific content, which you've got a number of different sections here of non-scientific content. You've got the budget and budget justification to work up, and then you have someone to manage consultants, subcontractors, partners, get the letters of support that you need, biosketches, budgets, et cetera. So can one person do all of this? See the example in front of you. Not recommended. I'm actually only 35 years old, and I had a lot more hair beforehand. But this is a lot of work, and I think the ideal situation would be to team up with at least one or more, at least one person, but hopefully more than that, to try to parcel out some of the responsibilities for grant submission.
Andy, I have a question.
Yes.
So if you're saying as a team, how long do you take to write a grant as a team, and how would you if it's a team of two? I imagine many of the people in this room are writing in teams of no more than 3 or 4. So how much time do you think they should allocate to this process?
Here we go. Grant submission timeline. So
Sign of a good talk when
and
a question
I didn't even
leads to the
pay you
next
to
one.
ask that question.
I'll give you a bill later, though.
Thank you. To me, if you haven't figured out you're going to write a grant submission about 2 months in advance, then you're really under the wire. And I have to say, I've written a grant submission with 1 week's notice. That 1 week was one of the worst in my lives. It was basically 12-hour days every day, whatever. And I happened to be fortunate because that was one of these areas where NIH desperately needed something that was very timely, and there weren't going to be a lot of other applicants. But I don't recommend that. So I think that the best idea is that at least 2 months in advance, you know what you want to, whether you're going to submit a grant or what you want to submit. And then there are a number of divisions of responsibility here in terms of who does what and what needs to be done when. So on the administrative front, as I said, I recommend in your team you have someone to deal with the administrative needs of grant submission because they're not scientific. They take away from your time in doing scientific writing, but they have to be done, and they have to be done accurately. So, the business of registering with the various government websites, that all has to be done long in advance. More important, perhaps, that in terms of working out budgets, again, most scientific training is not exactly about working out budgets on spreadsheets, but that's what it boils down to in the end because you're after funding. So, in the end, what the reviewers eventually look at, especially within the NIH, is your budget. And is it reasonable? So it helps to have somebody who's going to be on top of that budget from the beginning to work it out, weeks in advance and go through a number of iterations. And I have this happening over this 2-month period, basically, so that you have time for multiple iterations. What you do have to do very early on is identify who your players are going to be. Because presumably if you're submitting the grant, then you yourself might be the principal investigator, or maybe you're working with someone else who's a principal investigator. But you have to figure out who your team is going to be of investigators. And if there are people that if it is going to include external players, then you need to get in touch with them early on, because sometimes those negotiations take time, and you will need to get budgets from external collaborators often, and you will need to get letters of support. And that doesn't usually work well when you call them up the day before the grant is due and say, could I get a letter of support by 5 p.m. today? So I think that all those things work best when you start early on. There are also a number of other things. Human subjects protocols, for instance. If you're using human subjects, which in the life sciences is often the case, it really helps to get protocols early on so that they can be incorporated into the grant. You do not need IRB approval when you submit a grant. You only need it when you get the grant. But to submit it, at least you need to know what the human subjects protocol is in general outline, so you can submit that. So that can take some time to work out. Data, if you have preliminary results, well, we'll talk about that later, but preliminary data can be very helpful for a grant submission. And if you are still in the process of generating it, again, as you start focusing on what that grant is going to look like, you have a better idea of what kind of preliminary data you need to generate. So it's nice to have the timeline to generate anything you don't already have. And then there is the minor business of producing the grant, which means writing until you go practically nuts, going through multiple drafts, having them reviewed and edited and rewritten, et cetera. And that works best, again, when you have a number of weeks to do it. It doesn't work well when you're doing it by pulling all-nighters, which I can also attest to. So that's sort of a 2-month program to me. And one of the essential things you have to know is that NIH has this electronic submission process where you upload the files through their system. I'm not going to go into that because you can get all that information online, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. But the bottom line is the NIH software and electronic submission system is not bug-free. And it has its subtleties. And what typically happens when you are working down to the wire to a 5 p.m. electronic submission deadline is you press the magic button and you get an error message. And then you're stuck because you're going to go beyond the cutoff time. And what is even worse than that is when you get an error message 12 hours later that your submission did not go through. So the only way around this now is to submit at least a day early, 24 hours early, because it can take that long for NIH to generate electronic error messages now. Their system has become progressively slower, not faster with time. And as a result, you, the submitter, are now responsible for checking for error messages in the electronic website, ERA Commons. You can't assume that everything went through just because you didn't hear from them. It's your responsibility to make sure things are going through. And you may not catch an error message. It may not appear for 12 hours after submission. So NIH has made it pretty much mandatory to do the submission a day before the due date. So that is something you have to keep in mind pretty much in planning your activities. And as I want to highlight here, what's important is to write a little every day. And it's just a habit. You have to get into the habit of writing a little every day so that you keep the process moving so you're making incremental progress. Now let's talk about the budget for a moment. Again, we have most SBIR grants going through a phase 1, phase 2 progression. So phase 1 budgets used to be $100,000, now it's $150,000. Phase 2 used to be $800,000, now it's $1 million. NIH typically has some flexibility around those numbers. On paper, they say 50%, up to 50% more. But that's sort of the general level. There are some exceptions to those numbers, which I think are on one of these slides here. But the first thing is, what is the reality around what you want to do? Can you do it for that much money? Because you have to convince the reviewers that you can do it for that much money and that it's a reasonable amount. So the reality factor is the first thing. Is it really? And then you got the question, if there are going to be external collaborators, how much budget do they need? because if they need something significant, that comes out of the total pie, and you have to make sure there's enough for them and for you. And those negotiations are best held not the day before the grant is due. Okay? Typical grant budgets are about 60% personnel costs. It's really to support people, and then the remaining 30-something percent materials, supplies, et cetera. I mentioned instrumentation and travel. That's a category on the grant applications, and it's one of those frowned upon categories. So you have to keep it in mind as to what you really need, knowing that NIH does not like to buy instrumentation for people, and it doesn't like to buy trips for people. But it will if adequately justified. Padding versus reasonableness, again, how much is a reasonable budget? Our reviewer is going to come to the conclusion that you really only need one person on that project, not two, and you're just throwing in a second person to get more money. You have to make it reasonable.
There's a question. Yes?
All right. I was wondering, I've heard someone say that the phase one is basically never enough money, and then you were saying about the reality factor. What do you think about the idea of basically promising more than you're actually getting the money for, because you're trying to beat out some competition for phase two and sound?
So the question is, given that phase one is not a lot of money, do you overpromise? Is that what you're saying? Basically say more, you can achieve more than you can with the actual amount of money.
Tend to do as much as possible, right? Make yourself stand out.
So I'll give you the short answer now, and the somewhat longer answer is on slides that are yet to come. The short answer is that I don't recommend doing that, because in the end it will catch you up. And the reviewers are not going to be fooled by over-promising in the end. They're going to hold it against you, not for you. You have to think through whether what you're proposing makes sense within the budget that's available. If that budget can't support it, you only have a few choices. You can find some other money and then tell the NIH that you've got additional funding from other sources that can contribute. They love that. Or you can figure out some way to cut down on the specific aims to where it is feasible. In budget, again, this is just practical matters, but the NIH forms have their own budget input, which is extremely clumsy, and so for practical purposes, I recommend build an Excel model for budget. Once you build it, you can reuse it indefinitely, and you can create and modify your budgets until they do exactly what you need. So question, do you get any points for being economical and asking for less than the maximum allowable? Yes or no? Anyone have any answers? The answer is no. You do not get any points. You may as well ask for the maximum allowable. They won't hold it against you, and they'll just be puzzled if you didn't ask for that. What happens if you ask for more than the maximum? Well, it depends. That's something where you really need to discuss that with NIH in advance, because there are circumstances where they will support that. If you can convince the agency and the program officer that what you're doing is going to save the world, which of course it will, then they may say, okay, that's worth throwing in an extra $1,000. No, actually, hopefully more than that. But there are occasions when NIH will justify a much larger allocation for a grant if it meets one of their specific agency needs, for instance, and you have a real good justification for what the money is going to be used for. Otherwise, if you go way over what their nominal limitations are, you'll get a call or something saying, we can't go further with this until you revise your budget. So that's the answer there.
You said that was up to 50% more?
That's on paper, and so again, if you're going to go above what they say is the nominal limit, like $150,000 for a phase one budget, it is best to call the program officer first and discuss that with them and say, I'm going to submit this. This is what I need. Is that okay with you guys? And they'll tell you. Budget justification. Again, I'm just going to race through this because it's pretty obvious that you need to justify why you have each person on the grant, what materials and supplies you need. I list them out on spreadsheets so that they know exactly what I'm getting. Instrumentation and travel, I mentioned that they don't like that. However, I have to say I just bought a toy instrument, a nice big automated immunoassay processor, which the government funded specifically because it was part of a larger project, and they agreed to the instrument purchase up front. So you want to make sure that any of those instrument or large purchases are agreed up front. Subcontracts, again, you have to be very specific about justifying subcontracts or consortium partners, which can be a very important and helpful part of a grant. And of course, any other significant costs.
Sorry, one question on the rates for people. Is there any guideline or justification? For example, if somebody's paid X in a purely commercial environment, is there an expectation that they would be paid half X in this type of proposal, or?
If it's like consulting fees to an individual who happens to be from the industry world or something like that, then there's a broad range of consulting fees that people charge. And there isn't, as far as I know, there is no absolute cutoff, but I think there are going to be some questions if you have a $3,000 a day person on your budget. If you have someone who's charging $250 an hour for a couple hours, probably that's okay. But if they start seeing extremely high rates, they might start questioning that. If it's a private company doing work under a consortium agreement, then you have to get their budget and they have to be able to justify it the same way as you do being the primary applicant. So storyline of the grant. This is very important because this is what it's all based on. I'm a fiction writer in the grant proposal genre. So, the point here is that the grant tells a story. And people like reading stories, especially stories with a clear message. So your story is about how you and a band of fearless coworkers came up with a new mousetrap, better than everybody else's, and you're going to make the world a better place. And so you have to ask, does your grant read like a story? Is it going to keep people reading through it, wanting to see what the end is like? Does it flow smoothly and seamlessly? Is it written in a simple style, easy to understand? Are the take-home points clear and memorable? So if you can't explain it simply, you didn't understand it. That's a key point to me, in that I think one of the problems people get into is making the grant application too much like a journal article, when it's really a sales pitch. It's a story that has to engage the reader. The reader is the guy who's going to decide whether you get funded. So you have to draw them in, make them want to keep reading through it. It has to be well written from that point of view. And so who is your audience who you're pitching this story to? You think that it's scientifically well-educated individuals who understand your field and they're going to analyze, judge your work fairly. Well, in the reality, NIH often has trouble coming up with qualified reviewers. I mean, look, they asked me. And the SRA ends up, SRA is the scientific review agency, the scientific review administrator, the person at the NIH who is in charge of rounding up a bunch of reviewers for a given study section. The SRA often has to put together a group whose major qualifications are that they're available. Their blood temperature is at least 98.6, and they have some relationship, however distant, to the field. And that's not a joke, because often they send out a list of expertises, and they say, you the potential reviewer, check off what your expertises are in these various areas, and then we'll distribute the grant applications for review, trying to match them to your expertise. So you might end up with something which fits one of your more marginal expertises rather than your core expertise, and then you're the reviewer on that application. So unfortunately, I've done that. And I use that to learn about new fields, but that's probably not ideal for the applicant. And so this is what you have to deal with, that your readership is often so much less knowledgeable than you really think. Do not overestimate the knowledge base you're directing the application at for review. So in other words, you can't overwrite it at a level much higher than what the average reviewer is going to be reading it at. Now, what determines whether the application is successful or not? Well, I think the answer is going to fill more than one slide. Okay, but let's just start here. We're dealing with the problem of psychology and perception. It's not the science itself. Okay, that's again the storyline message. And this is a bit heretical perhaps, but the goal is not to come up with the world's best science, even though we think that's the goal. But the goal for funding purposes is to convince the audience that you meet the criteria they are looking for to be entitled to a fundable score. So it's a somewhat different concept here, that you're not trying to get them as, let's say, you're not trying to hook them with the scientific message by itself, but with a story that makes them believe in the end that you have met all of their criteria. And I've got some quotes in here which I've taken from some very interesting online blogs. People talk back and forth about the NIH grant submission, application process, and review process. And a lot of this, again, this is coming from people who are writing grants and being either accepted or rejected. So some interesting opinions. And we have people saying, unfortunately, if your grant doesn't grab the immediate interest of the 3 scientists who happen to review it, no amount of impeccable science will save you. And that's sort of the reality that we're all dealing with here. The gut reaction of the reviewer really the main factor. However, all the same, make your approach clear to the reviewer, ensuring that your approach makes sense. Certainly helps when get funded. Okay. So, again, what determines whether it's successful or not? I got somebody who I enjoy reading a lot, Malcolm Gladwell, and this book, Blink, I think captured a lot of interesting ideas which I found very applicable. So how long does it take people to make a judgment on something new that they are reading? Is it days, hours, minutes, seconds? Anyone remember?
Seconds, milliseconds.
Seconds, that's right. It's a very sort of instinctive process, it appears. Human psychology is wired to take in new information, digest it to the point of a value judgment very, very quickly, and everything beyond that point just serves to support or refute a decision which has already been made consciously or unconsciously. That's sort of Gladwell's premise in the book, and I think that it applies very well to the grant review scenario. Not particularly fortunately, but that's the way it is. And then we have this question here that, what is writing a grant all about? Well, I realize the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. Well, so we're trying to do the opposite, okay? And in order to do the opposite, it's going to be slow, it's going to be painful, and it's going to be adversarial. And it may lead to sleep deprivation, I can guarantee that one, erratic behavior, and excessive consumption of alcohol, which better that should start after you submit it. So a lot of this involves building credibility, okay? Eliminate the negative. The goal is to eliminate in the question in the reviewers' minds, do these guys know what they're doing? So you need to do that so that you can build the positive. Once you've eliminated the negative part from the reviewers' minds, then you build the positive. You want to convince the reviewers that the question is not whether the science is sound. Of course it's sound because you've just explained it very simply. Your data support whatever the concept is. It's not whether the investigators are qualified because you've proven that, or whether the resources are available, you've got them. It's only whether the aims are important enough to be worth funding. You want to get them to the point where that's what they're thinking, because they've already checked all the boxes for all the other things. So they believe that your science is good, et cetera. And the remaining thing is, does this look like a valuable thing to fund? So again, the argument from your side is we've convinced you that the science, the investigators, the organization, the resources are credible. So if you believe these aims are high enough priority to justify funding, then why would you not score this grant at a level that will ensure funding? How could you dare not to score our grant at a level that will get it funded? So you want to bring the reviewers through that process. It's a process of building credibility. solid science based and valid data rather than an untested hypothesis. You want to create the impression in their mind, whether it's true or not, that it's solid science. That you've got a sound approach using proven methodology. We'll talk about the approach later because that's very critical. That you've got a world's best investigator team. Your investigators all have experience with prior grants, with publications, product development, whatever it takes. You're in an organization with some history of success, and if it's a startup, that may or may not be the case, but at least if you have anything to draw on, you draw on it. If you have any prior grants, especially grants that turn into successful products, that's something you toot your horn about. You've got the world's best collaborators, you've got all the resources under the sun, and very importantly, you have access to whatever the study population is, which again, if it's human subjects work, you're going to have a study population. So these are all things that help you build credibility behind your application.
Andy?
Yes.
With your team, you talked about investigators. So is that primarily scientific folks? And is there value in bringing others from industry into that fold?
The key, I'm going to address that later on, but the key is really that for whatever activities you're proposing in your grant application, you need to show that you've got people with all the relevant expertise. And because if you don't, somebody's going to nail you on that. So it doesn't matter whether they're from industry or academia, they just have to have the relevant expertise. Example being, as I said, I work in the area of infectious diseases and pathogens. At some point, I was proposing some project or other that involved growing bacteria. And although we have done that in our lab plenty of times, et cetera, we didn't have a microbiologist in the key personnel list. And the reviewers came back and said, well, this project is all about microbiology and uses bacterial cultures. And there's no evidence that anyone on this team has any experience with bacterial cultures. Where's the microbiologist? So, they took off a couple points. And the answer was, well, we just went out and found a microbiologist. And we got somebody to sign on for some period of time, some fractional amount of effort. And we submitted their CV, their biosketch in the next resubmission. And while I can't remember how that turned out, that's how we address that. That's how anyone would address that. If you're found not to have relevant expertise, that counts against you. So you just make sure that everything you're doing as an activity in the grant, you've got somebody who knows how to do it.
Question is, did soliciting that microbiologist and submitting their CV, did that happen within the current funding cycle, or did you have to resubmit at the later 3-time-a-year cycle?
It's always a resubmission. Yeah, I'll go over that too. It's back to writing. We're constructing a narrative for the scientific content. It has to weave all these pieces together, the market need, the scientific basis, investigator, the organizational credibility, et cetera, into something that's really compelling. And there's some red flags here. For instance, inadequate preliminary data. We'll talk about that because that's a red flag. If you have no data, that's one problem. If you have data which don't support what you're claiming, that's another problem. So it's best to have data that do support what you're trying to do. Investigators without relevant experience we just talked about, lack of resources including target study population. If you were going to say, I'm going to study a group of, or we're constructing some gizmo for patients with artificial joints, and so we need to have access to that population. If you don't have proof in your grant application that you've got a study population of patients with artificial joints available to you for study, they're going to say, no, you obviously can't do the work, so you don't have the study group. Supporting letters are the letters that would prove that you have access to all these resources, so you need those. And overambitious program, earlier question, if they read the application, they say, this is really great, but this is really a 5-year program these guys are proposing, and we're giving them 6 months of support. This is not going to fly. They do not want to throw money at something that they know is doomed to failure because it's overambitious. So you have to really gauge what is reasonable there. So I'm just going to show you how I put together grant applications here in a very practical way. We print them out as we're writing iterations of the application. So at some point when we have enough pages written at an early point, we tape them together. We put them starting from the first page all the way through, and this is just the scientific content. It's not all the administrative pages. But we tape them all together like that. We lay them out on a table, and the idea is to read through it and see how it flows. And I just find that I can visualize it much better if I have it all in front of me rather than on a screen where I'm looking at only one page at a time typically. Because once I have it all in front of me like this, then I can say, oh, this part really doesn't belong here, it belongs up here because the flow of the story is better that way. And this part is duplicated, it's redundant, so we'll just chop it out. And this part should have gone before that part because logically that's the way it has to be. It's easier to see that, I think, at least to me, when I lay it all out physically in front of me, and then I can scan down from beginning to end, and I can sort of try to see how is the reviewer going to perceive it. They're going to be reading through it like this. They're probably not going to do exactly this, but they have to, again, follow the flow that we're trying to create from beginning to end. Note content which is missing, the relative volume of each section of content. Sometimes you get over enthusiastic and you write 10 pages on something and it doesn't fit, or it's way out of proportion to how important that part is in the overall picture. And then figures, it's important to figure out how much space you need for figures and to have that amount of space so they're legible. A key issue in terms of making your application fall within NIH's paradigms is this old question of hypothesis-driven versus exploratory research. I don't know if you've dealt with that distinction here, but this is something that NIH deals with. And basically what we mean by this is that hypothesis-driven research means I'm going to try to prove X, and here are the logical experiments that will prove it or disprove it, and at the end of the day, once we've done these experiments, we'll have an answer. It'll be yes or no. And on the other hand, exploratory research is I'm out there trying to discover a new compound to cure cancer. I don't know what it is yet, but you give me a lot of money and I'll find it. So two different paradigms, and point blank, NIH favors hypothesis-driven science because it fits within a very predictable, manageable model for them. Predictable, incremental, quantifiable, versus exploratory research, too dependent on chance, not on planning. Suppose you don't find the cure for cancer. But they do have a mechanism called R21 grants, which is different than SBIR, which is specifically aimed at that. So as you're developing your concept for a grant application, you probably want to be sure which bin it falls into, because if it's more on the exploratory side and it's more the kind of project where we don't have it but we're out there looking for it, you might be better off applying for an R21 grant than an SBIR grant. R21 grant carries, right now it's a maximum of $225,000, I think. So it's a small grant, but it's enough to get going, and NIH makes that available to people precisely to get them started on an exploratory project with the intention that it will mature, as they say, into a hypothesis-driven project. So once you develop some data from your explorations, you'll be able to turn it into a hypothesis-driven grant application, most likely an R01, but it could become an SBIR. So you do want to be sure which of these paradigms you're following here. So grant components, I just sort of looked at it like this, that we've got a bunch of key components of the grant application which have to come together in one body. And I outlined or highlighted in red here the ones which are sort of the key scientific content, and the rest are more the accessory, mostly non-scientific content. So phase one application, we're talking phase one SBIR grants in the traditional two-phase model. You get 1 page of specific, this is a 6-page application now. So you get 1 page of specific aims, and you get 6 pages for what is now divided into 3 sections: significance, innovation, and approach. NIH went to this model a few years ago. They converted their older model, which had background, preliminary studies, methodology, et cetera, into a shorter format, thinking that whatever you were going to say in 25 pages, you can actually say in 6 pages. And that just goes back to my Malcolm Gladwell model, I think, because I think it's basically true that you can figure out a way to say it in less space. You just have to be more succinct without a lot of the details. And so they've reduced it now to these 6 pages. And typically you get about 1 page for significance, you get about 1 or 2 pages for innovation, you get about 3 or 4 pages for the approach, and that's it. That's your 6 pages. It gets eaten up very quickly. Phase 2 applications nowadays, you get 12 pages, and so you get a page of specific aims, but then the significance, innovation, and approach, you get 12 whole pages to play with, which is quite a lot. I'm going to give you some examples of phase 1 applications.
Where does the commercialization plan fit in? It's not included within the 6 and 12 page limits?
Commercialization plan is only in phase 2 grants, unless there's a specific grant application or grant solicitation the NIH has put out for some specific topic where they want some commercialization input. But otherwise, the phase 1 application doesn't have it. The phase 2 grant has a 12-page separate commercialization section. I've got a slide on that later, but that does not count against your 12 pages of science and specific aims and whatever, totally separate. So that's something which for phase 1 you don't yet have to worry about. So
I think that's depending on the agency, correct? I think NSF.
Again, for NIH, that's
yeah.
the way it is. I don't know about, say, DOD or
Yeah,
some
so
of
I
these
think
other
if you're
agencies.
ever applying for an SBIR and other agencies, be sure to check whether or not a commercialization plan is required, because if it is and you don't have one, don't even bother.
Right.
Because I think the NSF does have that, from my and more of the physical sciences.
And any program where you have a commercialization plan as a requirement, that becomes a serious component, but it's also a really selling point, because that's where you get to throw in a lot of projections of the glorious future, which is a little different than the science, which in principle is based on some of the preliminary data that is what you've already done. Yeah?
So if researcher X and X institution has done all this research, and now you want to bring that to market, can you jump to phase 2 already?
Well, that's where NIH has just put out this solicitation for direct phase 2 grants, which many NIH agencies have signed on to, maybe not all. And again, I don't know anything about non-NIH government agencies here, but for NIH now, the solicitation that's online says that if you have basically the equivalent of a phase 1 project, results from a phase 1 project, you can go directly to a phase 2 application. So I think that's very important. That's a major step forward for them, because many people might have that. You might have done a year or whatever of preliminary work and have data and results and whatever, and be able to put together a phase 2 application right off the bat. So I'm going to talk a little bit about specific aims here, because this is a very important part of any application. This is the first major thing that reviewers see after the abstract, which is really half or a quarter of a page. So the specific aims, in a way, has to make the case for the whole grant. And so the first thing is, for specific aims, you don't want too many, because you have to focus on a doable number of aims, things that are the most important. I guess my bullet points are out of order here. You need reasonable milestones for the phase 1 to phase 2 transition. So if you're applying for phase 1, these specific aims are going to encapsulate what you are going to do by the end of phase 1, so that when you go to phase 2, you can say, see, we did these things that we said we were going to do. And they have to meet the criteria for success that you're going to describe in your aims. And you have to describe how progress will be measured quantitatively and or qualitatively. Not everything can be measured quantitatively, but it helps. So these are the things that make for a what I would call successful specific aims page. And I've got some examples. So we'll just read through this whole thing. Actually, we won't read through this whole thing. I wanted to show you some examples from grants that either I or my group has submitted over previous years, and just point out some highlights here. So first showing you what it looks like, and then a little more in depth here. This happens to be a grant about developing a test for Chagas disease. This is a parasitic disease. And so the key things in these specific aims that I wanted people to respond to, first we start with a statement which explains what the big deal is. Well, this is something which has now emerged as a significant new threat to transfusion safety. So, if you were a reviewer and you read this and you said, oh, a significant new threat, hopefully that triggers some brain cells and said, this might actually be important. And then you read through this stuff, which is what this problem is all about, why this is such a threat. And then you get to a statement that says, so there's a significant gap in the testing of blood donors for this disease, and the consequences for patients, for blood donors, are serious, so that confirmation is warranted, et cetera, et cetera. So you get to this thing that says consequences are serious, and so again, you want the reviewer to be thinking, this is an important thing that needs to be addressed. And to meet this need, this is what we're going to do. So in your specific aims, a large part of it is what you are going to do to respond to this very important problem you've identified. And what we're saying is we're going to develop a test for Chagas disease here. So we've said what the most important thing is that we're going to do. We're going to develop a new test which will do what the world needs. And then we've broken it down into specific aims that are the nuts and bolts of the application. And in this case, we've got 2. As I said, you don't want too many specific aims, although you can have sub-aims. So aim 1 is development of a prototype. So generally that works pretty well for a phase 1 grant, because the phase 1 grant is intended to show feasibility of your concept. Is not intended to show, to get you to the final stage of having a new gizmo already made. That's phase 2. All you need to do for phase 1 is to show that it can be done, that your science is working for you, and you can get to the stage of prototype that will set you up ideally for phase 2. So as a specific aim, development of a prototype makes sense. And we put some target qualifiers around that in the second specific aim, preliminary characterization. So we've got numbers here, quantitative measurements of what our success criteria are. 99.99% of this, 99.5% of that. Our goal for sensitivity, et cetera, will be 99% in phase 1. So we've set it right out plain there, and so a reviewer looking at that ought to conclude, well, they said exactly where they want to go with this and what they will consider success. And that makes it very simple and very clear. And we said to do this, we're going to test several hundred patient samples, so that pretty much tells them what the activity will be that we're going to do.
Andy?
Yes.
For the phase 1, you had set, I guess, a goal of 99.5%. If you were to have only reached 95%, would that deem you or render you ineligible for a phase 2?
Not necessarily. You have to play with, you have to take advantage of your data and your results however best you can, because in many cases, the reality is different than your model. And so in a phase 2 application, you're going to have to explain that. If your starting point in phase 2 is not exactly where you thought it was going to be based upon what you projected in phase 1 as your end goals, you have some explaining to do, but that's part of what the grant application is intended to do. Because in a phase 2 application, you will have embedded a phase 1 report, report on what you did in phase 1. and you'll say, well, we got to 95% for the following reasons. The study population did not actually meet all the criteria or whatever. It's not our fault, you know. And or you'll say, we got this far because the science proved to be extremely, more challenging than we anticipated. But now we have ways to move it forwards to 99% under phase 2. So, basically you're trying to work with whatever you've got. Sometimes the answer is it just can't be done, in which case maybe the thing to do is hang up your hat and go try a different direction. But you're basically trying to make credible targets in your specific aims, targets that you believe in, not things that are unreasonable. But if you have the science to substantiate what your specific aim targets are, you should put them down, like that. If you yourself don't believe they can be done, you shouldn't put them down. So in our overall scheme of content in an application, you go from specific aims into the research plan, which has these 3 sections, again, the significance, the innovation, and the approach. And I just copied here, you don't have to read this, but this is just the boilerplate that is on the NIH websites where they tell you what they expect to go into these 3 sections. It's all the highfalutin stuff, explain the importance of the problem, the critical barrier to progress, how the proposed project will improve scientific knowledge. So that's something that you should eventually read over, just so that you know what the official expectations are. And I've also put here a copy of the 6-page application that we submitted for one of our projects, which embodies these 3 sections: significance, innovation, and approach. Again, the intent was to show you more or less what it looks like. It's got mostly text, but I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 figures in the background sort of approach section here, which summarize preliminary data that we had. And then we've got another figure out here, which I can't see, and then we've got a timeline down there. So we've made it a pretty dense application. There is no wasted space in this application. And we do that by being very attentive to spacing and doing a lot of editing. But to look a little more carefully at it, this is taken from, I think, the same one. Again, we've got a significant section. I took a little bit of the text out here, and to highlight the important stuff, we've tried to put right up front here, impact. What's the major thing we want to get across to people? Well, the incidence of fungal infections, blah, 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 has continued to increase over the past 20 years. Incidence of hospitalizations in the US rose by over 50% between 2000 and 2005. And so, again, if you're a reviewer and you're reading, well, your first question is, what is significant about this project? And you see, well, now this is the 4th most common, nosocomial, hospital pathogen, and it's increased significantly, and you've now got 50% more infections than before. Hopefully that's ringing bells in somebody's head saying, again, this is a major problem. This deserves to be addressed. And then down at the bottom here, we close out, after a little detail here, we close out by giving some numbers. Mortality rates range from 55 to 71%, in some cases up to 80%. Healthcare costs, over $30,000 per case, in some cases over $60,000 per patient. Those are important things because, again, people are thinking, how important is this problem? Does this cost the healthcare world a lot of money, or does it kill people, or what? So we're saying, does both. Couldn't be better as far as justifying the application. And of course, we say current methods are inadequate. Slow timing, lack of this. So we're closing saying, this is a significant need. It's a financial problem. It's a financial burden. It kills people, and current solutions are inadequate. So that's really setting the stage for playing up the rest of the grant, being able to show how important this is. And then again, after some more detail, we close by saying an unmet need in this area is an assay that can do this, can provide accurate results within a reasonable time period, et cetera. So we're saying an unmet need. We're trying to, again, focus them that we have we are proposing to meet something which doesn't exist, an unmet need. There's nothing out there.
Andy, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you talk about the cost per patient in this phase 1 grant because it's primarily based on feasibility. When you're moving into a phase 2, do you have to then justify that whatever you're creating is in fact cost saving? Because if you create something that's a lot more expensive than what is currently available, like how do they look at that?
Yes, I backloaded that issue into the end of the presentation, but the quick answer there is that's an excellent question because it's very important. I think one of the things that NIH is after is trying to find more cost-efficient ways to deliver improved health care. And right now, I think we know that the cost of health care in the U.S. is just staggering. It's killing the country. I'm not going to go political on this, but at any rate, NIH is very much looking for what they would call cost-effective ways to improve health care, not ways to add more cost, ways to reduce overall cost. So if you are proposing the world's greatest mousetrap and it happens to cost $1 million a mousetrap, I don't think you're going to have too many takers, certainly not in the government. So I think it's very important to be able to describe how your product or service is going to improve the economics of health care. There isn't really a good venue for describing that in the phase 1 application because there is no commercial section, but you can get it into this significance part more or less as we did here, or maybe into the innovation section. It's worth taking a paragraph or whatever to get that kind of information into the grant application because it really does, again, trigger reviewers to think, if this is really going to do the job and it's going to be more cost effective than what is currently out there, why wouldn't we want to support it? So I think that's a key point. I wanted to discuss innovation because that's a buzzword for NIH. And the SBIR program is called the Small Business Innovative Research Program, I think. So everyone talks about innovation. And I wanted to sort of make the point that it's a bit of a double-edged sword here. That NIH is, in truth, challenged in finding ways to support highly innovative science in an atmosphere of risk avoidance. And so perhaps I'm being a little bit pessimistic, but I'm trying to give you, information which will help you play the grant strategy to position your grants in the right, the sweet spot, let's say, for innovation. Too much innovation can make a project scientifically risky, and that's the problem with it. People don't like risk. Too little innovation, and it's considered it's not cutting edge. And of course, NIH wants to back only cutting edge science.
How do applying for patents fit into this timeline?
Very much so. A patent is an excellent bit of proof of innovation. We all know, anybody who's written patents or whatever, applied for patents, knows that a patent can be on a very, very narrow thing. And just because you have a patent or a patent applied for, it doesn't mean that you have some marvelous new mousetrap. But the NIH doesn't necessarily know that when they read your application. And of course, if you do have a patent on file or about to be submitted or issued or whatever, you're going to make the most of that in the application. And you're going to say that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and this is proof that you have something innovative because it couldn't have been patented if it weren't innovative. So very much important. So you have to be clear what the innovation in the project is and what it isn't. And reviewers do not automatically understand this. I'll have an example in some number of slides. Do not equate innovative with experimental / unsupported by solid data. You still need to convince reviewers that innovation does not introduce an uncontrolled risk into the equation. They don't like that. Reviewers may target methods which are essential but not innovative, like PCR, and I can tell you I've had a reviewer come back on one of my grant applications and where we were working up something to detect some pathogen, and PCR was one of the methodologies. And the reviewer said, well, this is not innovative because PCR has already been done. And I thought, yeah, that's true. And no, we never claimed that the innovation in the grant was about the PCR. You know, PCR is just a method, and it's a method in everybody's toolbox, and it shouldn't be held against us. But reviewers don't necessarily think like that. So you have to be very careful in terms of pointing out what is innovative versus what is not innovative about your application. Likewise, reviewers can look at your methodology. You know, if you're doing something with, in our field, immunoassay as a workhorse. So, you know, we got immunoassays in many of our projects, and the reviewers can say, well, immunoassay has been done. It's not innovative. And they're not going to look beyond the fact to realize that, of course, there are zillions of different ways of doing something that is called an immunoassay. And one method could be new, one method could be old, whatever. But they tend to take these soundbite approaches in many cases. So your job is to clarify what is truly, you know, the innovative element in your application versus what is not. And what is the evidence? Well, we talked about patent filings. Provisional patent filing can sometimes get you there for a relatively small amount of time and money. You know, utility filing, full-scale filing is even better. Proprietary technology, if you've got something that is confidential, hasn't been patented, you can describe that. An SBIR application is a confidential document. They do say in the application instructions that if you have confidential material inside, you should put a star or something in the margins to indicate what is confidential information. My feeling is legally, for purposes of filing a patent that's valid, the patent office wouldn't hold it against you if you had material in an SBIR application. But that material is going to go to a bunch of reviewers. And those reviewers may or may not include people you don't like, or that is to say, your competitors. You don't always have control over that, so you have to keep that in mind. We talked about that. Confidential information, right. So in innovation section, again, this is from one of our grants. And again, just to point out that we've got some data in here trying to support what we think is innovative. And so again, I've excerpted a little bit of this to show you that we've got in this innovation section call-outs. It says the proposed project objectives will be achieved through two innovative approaches. So I've used the word innovative to clue them in that this is what we're calling innovative. Number one, clade-specific targeting of assay antigens, blah, blah, blah. Number two, novel use of mosaic peptide design. So I've made it very specific what we consider the innovations are in the proposal. And then looking over at how the reviewers responded to this, I took some excerpts from the actual critiques that we got from reviewers on this application. And so it worked in some cases, but not all. We got one reviewer who said, this is what they're going to do. They'll do this novel database-derived peptide design. That's exactly what we discussed here. So he followed along with our argument. They will employ mosaic peptide design, et cetera. So this guy bought into what we said was innovative. He agreed with it. Second guy, same deal. Use of mosaics to accomplish sensitivity, et cetera, is innovative. That's what we said here, novel use of mosaic peptide design. So by spelling it out, we helped them respond in a positive way and say, yes, they're doing something innovative. They've told us what it is, so all we have to do is agree that, yes, this is innovative. The third guy didn't have a clue. That individuals will receive their testing results sooner. We didn't talk about that. However, again, you can't control reviewers. Sometimes they're thinking about something else. They're watching television. You don't necessarily know what they're doing. Okay? But these two, on the other hand, these were important critiques, and this grant got funded. Okay? And yeah, this was the title of the grant, and the score, the impact score was a 20, which made it fundable. And the resume of the discussion, again, we see here. Again, reviewers noted its particular strengths, blah, 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 innovative technology. And then a couple other things, the real need for the test, they bought into the significance. They brought into the history behind it. And preliminary data, solid preliminary data. and access to the study population. So all these are all the things that we deliberately tried to put together to show that we had the building blocks in place. They found some weaknesses, minor weaknesses, lack of information on the facilities and equipment available, and some lack of clarity on the availability of SIRA, et cetera. So these were considered minor, facilities. No one really cares that much about facilities, it seems, so they didn't hold it against us. Reviewers expressed high enthusiasm for the research. So basically, we deliberately tried to channel them into this conclusion by providing them with building blocks in each of those areas. And a second, reviewer concluded, research is very impactful. We had a logical approach based on preliminary data. This use of mosaics is innovative. Again, clued into that sentence that we put in there to deliberately focus them on that idea as the innovation. So basically, we got them to focus on what we thought were the strengths of the application and not on any weaknesses. Brief discussion about approach here. Is there a clear quantitative or qualitative assay for measuring progress and success? Well, the approach section is sort of the bulk of an application. Typically, in a phase 1 application, it might be 4 pages or 3 pages or whatever of the 6 you've got, depending on what you're writing about. And so you want quantitative or qualitative, you want measures of progress in there, one way or another. Is everything available that you need in order to do the work? If you don't, that increases the risk. And that includes access to people, samples, patients, whatever. It depends upon what your work is. But these are sort of key things that reviewers look for. Do you have a way of measuring where you're at? Do you have everything available that you need? Do you have patients or whatever you need available? So that's what you have to have in the approach section as you describe how you're using those resources through whatever methodology underlies your project. Part of what you want to present to support your approach is preliminary data. It's officially not required. Do you really need it? Again, yes versus no. Anyone think you don't? Well, obviously, yeah, you do need preliminary data if you can possibly get it to strengthen your application. It's not that they'll throw the application out if you don't have it, but you're competing against other people who do have it, typically. And so you do want to have it. So how much is enough? Well, too much, sometimes you throw so much preliminary data that the reviewers might say, well, you've already done it, so why are we giving you money to do it again? Too little, not convincing enough for feasibility, so there's some sweet spot where you're right in the middle and you can say, yes, we have enough data to prove that we've taken a lot of the really high risk out of it. It's not that what we're trying to do is impossible, it's just difficult.
Andy,
yeah.
I have a question. Just going back to that question about do you have the facilities, do you have the access to whatever samples? When you're writing your approach, you indicate that you'll be using these samples, you're not going to spend too much time or too much real estate saying that you have like these partnerships. Do you establish that through the letters of support? Like, how do you indicate that you actually have it without wasting that much space?
You will need the letters of support, and you will want to reference them. So in an approach section or an innovation section sometimes, you can be very succinct in saying, this is our study population resource. Let's say it's human patients. You would have a paragraph perhaps on study population in which you would say, this is what we're after, this target population. These will be provided by the following collaborators, see letters of support, and you'll give just enough detail in terms of numbers of subjects or samples or whatever, and qualifications or characterization to convince people that you really have what you need to work with. It is important to do that. Model experiments versus actual data. Again, in many cases, people are looking at an application and they're saying, well, these guys just did this one little model experiment. It wasn't even the real thing. And now they're spinning this huge story out of this. Well, maybe that's all you could do, but if you can possibly get real data, it's worth it because it has much more credibility than a non-real model scenario.
When you say model experiments, that's like a simulation?
Yeah. Again, there's a continuous range, obviously, but the closer to reality you get, the stronger your data are going to be. And if you don't, let's say what you're fighting against is the reviewer thinking, well, this is all they were able to show, and so I'm not convinced that they can actually do this based on this data. You want to have enough data to convince them that you can get there. And you do have to sort of highlight the positives, but mention any problems. You can't really shove things under the rug necessarily. Figures, I don't think I'm going to bother talking about. The cast of characters is important here. So principal investigator, that's somebody who they're going to look very carefully at the qualifications for the principal investigator. And they fall into sort of two buckets, either new investigators or old investigators. I guess I'm considered old by now, but NIH gives some perks to new investigators. And so if you're a new investigator, in theory, they'll give you some extra slack, some slack in the review, and that can be worth something. The alternative is if either you have some prior experience or you're teaming up with someone else as a principal investigator who has the experience, then you can benefit from their expertise and experience as a PI. But one way or the other, they're being looked at for their technical expertise, their leadership, their organizational skills, being able to manage a project which could get complex, experience with prior grants. Publications would be evidence that they've done something in the field. So you want to have as strong an individual as PI as you can get, and you want to have as strong a technical team as you can get. Again, it may be only one or two people, but you want to have all the expertise covered that you need to do the project, as I mentioned earlier. And that can include, consultants. Sometimes you get people from the outside. You only need them for 1 month or something, but that's very important. So that makes sense for short term, or you can get consortium partners more in a subcontract style who would be involved in a major contribution where they're maybe working for the whole 6 months or 1 year or whatever it is, and you have a subcontract mechanism with them. So all of these people are the ones who are going to give the application a lot of credibility, and that credibility is supported by the biosketches that you supply, in which you have a personal statement, and the personal statement is a way to get more supportive info in. So in the personal statement you can say, I am so-and-so, and this is what I've done, and this is what my expertise is all about. It's a way of building up your credibility, which does not count against your 6 pages of grant application. There's a 4-page limit on the PI biosketch and a 3-page limit on other biosketches, but that gives you plenty of space to make a strong statement, which again should help tell reviewers that you got a lot of expertise in the field, and hopefully you've got some publications or something for relevant expertise. Collaborators, again, I mentioned that it can be very, very important to get the right set of collaborators, and these can be people who will do some part of the project completely on their own, or they can be doing it with you or whatever, but whatever the case, they can add expertise from an organization that might be very solid. If you are a 1-person show or a 2- or 3-person show, but you can team up with an institute, that will give you a letter of support on their institute letterhead, and you'll have Mr. Big there, Dr. Big, signing off on it. That can lend, again, a lot of credibility to the application. You have to write the letter of support, however. Letters of support take time. Important people, I believe, are always busy. That's why they're important, and so they don't want to write letters. They don't want to be spending their time writing letters, so they expect that you, the applicant, will write the letter for them, and they'll just sign it. So once you've written some of these letters, you just keep a semi-generic version that you can modify for each individual grant application, and then you get them to sign it. And that's how you get it done on time. You also use the letter to inject a pitch for the grant. because now you're writing the letter, but it's being signed by Dr. Big, and it's going to say, I think that this project is the most important thing that I've seen in my whole career. And now it's coming from him or her, not from you. So you get to write that line in your letter of support. Also, if there are financial terms, nice to include that. You don't have to absolutely, but often the reviewers will say, where is the evidence that this is what they agreed to in terms of what they're going to bill for or whatever, billing rate, that kind of thing. Consortium justification. Again, there's a justification section in applications where you, the applicant, have to write why you need this kind of consortium. And that's, again, where you get to say that we need this expertise. We don't have it. They have it. It makes sense for us to pool our expertise. The sum is more than the parts. You also have to show how you're going to work with them. Because if you're here and you've got collaborators in San Francisco, which we have, and that's a good place to have collaborators. That's where the travel justification is helpful. You want to be able to show how the logistics are going to work. So if you both are going to be doing some kind of testing, let's say, some kind of use of patient samples, are you going to be shuttling patient samples from San Francisco to Boston and back? Well, maybe you are. Put them on dry ice, you ship them, they're here the next day, no big deal. But you have to explain that because it's not obvious to people. Or it might be, they have this monster piece of equipment and we don't, so we have to go there to do this experiment. You have to explain that, and you have to show that it's workable. The logistics can be made to work. Otherwise, they're going to say, well, they're there and you're here, and how are you going to get together and work successfully on this project? And so you say, this is why it's going to be successful, because we've worked together, we've got an established relationship, or because we've already agreed to this. You want to lay that out in the justification. I just am going to say briefly about human subjects. Again, many SBIR grants have a section you have to check off saying whether you have human subjects or not, and there are a number of parameters around them. NIH treats human subjects very, very, very seriously. Very seriously, more now than ever before. It's just continued to escalate with them. So that it's a criterion that is reviewed as part of the application. And there are a lot of discussions around human subjects use that I've heard. And you get feedback from them on human subjects. And the feedback is not always nice. And so if you are doing a project which involves human subjects, you really need to think through it carefully because it can float or sink an application. If you have, you want to work with a group of hospitalized patients or something, you're going to need to figure out how you get to those patients and what the legalities are. There is going to be an IRB question, whether you need institutional review board approval. If so, you don't need it for the application, but you need to show that you're going to get it. And you need to be able to describe how you're going to be treating these patients. Like we are going to draw, a liter of blood from this patient. Well, they might say, I don't know about that. But if you say, we're going to take blood samples from these patients during the normal course of treatment of the patient without taking a separate blood draw, that sounds like, oh, okay, so there's nothing, no higher risk for the patient. And you really do have NIH reviewers looking at that information carefully nowadays and saying they have to justify why they're doing this, otherwise it's not acceptable. Likewise, women, children, ethnic minorities, all of these are categories that you have to address in the human subject sections and show whether they're relevant, whether they're not relevant, if they are relevant, how you're dealing with them. Some disease conditions, for instance, have disproportional effect on some subpopulation of people, whether it's gender or something else. And so if you don't have that in there, again, that can become something which, if it doesn't, let's say, stop your application from being funded, it could certainly delay it because they might come back to you even if they like it and say, we're not going to fund it until you redo that part. So that's something to really pay attention to, but it can be a major resource if you have it figured out and you have a cogent justification and explanation. Facilities and resources, again, not going to spend any time there because especially in this town, there are a lot of facilities and resources, and that has very seldom been a issue for SBIR grants that I've seen. Yeah.
This may be too vague to answer, but this notion of subjects, whether animal or human subjects, can you characterize at all roughly what percent you would guess NIH SBIR grants involve human and/or animal subjects in the research? Is it looked at as a requirement, basically, or strongly favorably looked at?
No, it's not a requirement whatsoever. I don't think that there's a bias one way or the other. It's simply that if your work does involve human or animal subjects, then they're going to apply the full force of their criteria for approval. So you'll have to meet them. Cover letter, I think, again, this is information you can get online. The one thing that I do want to point out, or two things, are that you have the chance to indicate the expertise you want in the reviewers. You say, my project is on, mouse traps, and I would like to have on the review panel someone, someone with expertise in the mechanics of mouse traps. And that doesn't guarantee you'll get that kind of person, but at least you might. It suggests to the SRA, the review administrator, to go off and look for somebody, which might improve your chances of getting a favorable reviewer. It also is a chance to tell the NIH who you don't want to review your grant, like your competitors. And if you know who your competitors are, you can put them by name, you can put them by organization, and in principle, they have to honor that. Recycling. In many cases, you're writing multiple grant applications over a period of time, and to save time in new grant applications, the more information you can store generically and reuse, the better. So we generally make use of generic cover letters, facilities and resources, commercialization history, budgets, etc. All this in a form that can be quickly modified, so we're not spending a lot of time on that, we're spending our time on the scientific content. But it helps to just sort of put together this arsenal of material that you can reuse that way. The commercialization plan was brought up a little bit earlier, again, mostly for phase 2 grants, but I like to mention something about it in phase 1 in a very brief paragraph to let the reviewers and the NIH know that we are thinking ahead and we have a vision of where this is going commercially. It's not just pure science. And so, brief mention there. But the commercialization plan is clearly your chance to sell your commercial vision, and that means that you're obligated now to show that you have an understanding of the market and the market drivers. The downside is that reviewers tend not to be commercially savvy in your field because most of them are not from your field. That's why if you can try to bias the review administrator to get somebody in your field, that can help you. But in many cases, it doesn't work out that way, and you get someone who really doesn't know your field, but they can generally sort of intuit whether the plan is reality or whether it's smoke and mirrors. So that's something you have to be able to propose in a straightforward and relatively honest way, knowing that there are always uncertainties, but you have 12 pages, which is really a lot of space to do that. What you don't want to do is use this approach here. If you build it, they will come. No, they won't come just because you build it. We know that pretty much by now. Do some real market research to the extent you can, using as credible sources as you have access to. Be quantitative if you can. You're going to have a section in there, hopefully, on competition, where you have to be able to analyze you versus them. You have to highlight your proprietary position. If you do have patents or whatever, this is a great place to talk about it again. One of the areas that I find very sticky now is regulatory things. If you happen to be, unfortunately, working in a field regulated by the FDA, I say unfortunate because that's what we do, then there's a whole superstructure that goes around that of what it takes to develop and manufacture and sell a regulated product, meaning you're going to eventually have to get it approved by the FDA before you sell it. And so you're going to have all of the infrastructure that goes into that process. And it used to be that people didn't pay that much attention to that, and now they're paying progressively more attention to that. So if you say, you know, we're going to make a wonder drug or whatever, and you know, we're going to make it, and then the FDA is going to approve it, and then we're going to sell it, and we'll all go home happy. Somebody's going to ask, well, you know, do you have an FDA-approved facility to manufacture your product? Have you gone through the FDA's mandated design controls in developing the product? Do you have approved quality control and quality assurance in-house? And in many cases, this is a big challenge, especially for small companies, because FDA infrastructure is expensive and something that many people don't acquire until later on. But if you're in the process of making something which will be an FDA-regulated product, you're going to have to say something about that. If you don't have all the infrastructure in place now, you have to say how you're going to get it, you know, what your plan is. Like, you know, once we're in year 2 or year 3 or whatever, we expect to have funding available from our corporate sponsors or from whatever, because it's not going to be from NIH, to develop a quality assurance infrastructure meeting FDA requirements. And you know, we will have GMP, good manufacturing practices in place so that we can manufacture pilot lots of whatever the product is, et cetera. So if you don't say that, that's something people very well might look for. Manufacturing and launch plan, likewise, this is a business venture in the end. If you say we're going to develop it, then we really don't know what to do with it. That's not going to sound quite as convincing as if you say we're going to develop it, and then in the final year of phase 2, we're going to put in place the manufacturing capability for scaling up production so that on the last day of the grant, or whatever you want to say, we will be ready for a commercial launch. And it doesn't have to be the last day of the grant, but I think if the reviewers see that you have no real vision of how you're going to do the real commercial business, you know, if they see it as just an R&D project, that makes them less favorable, because they're going to say, well, this is a really nice project, but it's not going to result in a real product, you know, so why are we funding it? So you want to make it as realistic as possible, showing them that you've thought through all these mechanisms of how to get it to real tangible product state.
Andy, I have a question about the competition. So I just wanted to ask, because a lot of people, I think when they think competition, it's like people who are doing exactly what they're doing. But in the case for your immunoassays, like you would consider your competitors that are using other methods to detect the same infectious disease, correct?
I mean, competition, it sort of depends. If we're looking at competition in terms of in the commercialization section, then it's really a question of what methods or products are available to the consumer, to the customer. They may not be anything related to your field, but they may solve the customer's problem, solve the same problem in a different way. So that's sort of how you have to look at it there. So again, what do reviewers look for? They're looking for something that is synthesized into a consistent whole. Does the approach reflect the specific aims? Can it be carried out successfully with the resources available? Are these the right people with the right expertise? Do they have the right kind of preliminary data? And once they put this together in their head, then they develop, again, a construct in their minds. This makes sense. We think they can do this, or there's something that's funny about this. It doesn't make sense. And that's what makes the decision easier for them in the end. It's that intuitive feeling that it all comes together and it makes sense, or it doesn't all come together. So I've got some real life examples here from, again, grants that we have submitted, or in one case, a grant that was pulled off of the NIH website. So again, trying to get at how reviewers think. Oh, no, I was going to show you a little exercise in reading here, and I think we're going to skip that because of short time. So I'm going to move on here. We'll go through a little exercise showing you how you make something clear which really pertains to any part of the grant application, but I focused on the abstract here. The abstract is something that you submit as a separate section of the grant application. It's supposed to be 500 words or something like that, about a half a page, and it's publicly available. But it's something that is the first piece of written information that the reviewers see, and so you want to make that a strong statement in favor and support of the grant. And so I looked at sort of 4 parameters that have to be transmitted through this abstract: significance, problem, solution, and plan. And looking at how this happens, how this comes across in one or another abstract, I've got some examples here. This is a grant application, which is not ours, called Rapid Comprehensive Identification of Pneumonia Pathogens. And so we got this text here, but I've highlighted the key things here, which start with, hopefully with, whoops, it's stuck. There, okay. Significance. So in the abstract, we've got a statement up here: lower respiratory tract infections, including pneumonia, are a significant threat to human health, 7th leading cause of death in the United States. Again, this is something the reviewer reads right away. If I were the reviewer, I'd be thinking, well, 7th leading cause of death, that's a big deal, So we've established the significance of the problem right away. And defining causative organism is, okay, so this is the problem. Problem comes next. Significance was in the first sentence, is now the second sentence. So the problem is defining the causative is complex, define the organism. Standard methods don't work, they're too slow. So we basically use the second sentence or couple sentences to define what the problem is. And then the third, the solution. After the problem, well, diagnosis of pneumonia will be greatly aided by a rapid comprehensive analysis of patient samples. So this company makes rapid test products which do this. This project is all about this film array platform, fully integrated automated system, does everything you need, ease of use, short time to result, highly multiplexed. So this is putting the pitch out that we've got a solution, and here it is. And then lastly, the action plan. The action plan is we're going to test these panels of respiratory pathogens, et cetera, we've got methodologies here, we've got quantitation. So they've got a concrete action plan that they're showing here. So in this one abstract, you've got why this is important, the significance. You've got what is the problem, you've got what is the solution, and you've got what are they actually going to do. And condensed into a very nice package here. And that grant got funded. And then we have a second grant here, rapid diagnostic assays for avian influenza. So avian influenza was a big scare 2 or so years ago. The whole world was on high alert. I wasn't on high alert, I went to bed. But WHO seemed to think that it was a big deal, and then eventually they said, well, I guess nothing happened. However, the reality is that avian influenza is just one form of influenza, which is a major health threat worldwide. It's not going away one way or the other. It's probably coming back. So this was a project to develop more effective diagnostic tests for avian influenza. And so we have a somewhat more muddled abstract to go through here. So the significance statement is there have been increasing recent concerns that H5N1 or some other virus human-human transmission, and thus leads to an influenza pandemic with very high morbidity and mortality rates. Well, if you're reading a statement saying, well, there have been increasing concerns, are you going to, is that like an alarm clock? Are you going to stop what you're doing and, say, oh, we must get on top of this right away? It's a little vague, okay? And, whoops, what happened there? And so then we go next, after that first sentence, to not the problem, but the solution. The second sentence is part of the solution, but in fact there are 3 different sentences in here which are part of this solution statement. We propose this project to do this. Primary objective is this. Novel format of this assay doing this, thus identifying the subtype. So now the reviewer's attention is sort of scattered because this is not a a cogent presentation, we've got 3 different sentences in different parts of the abstract. And then sandwiched right in the middle, we've got a statement about the problem, about accurate diagnosis being the problem here. And then the plan, again, we got 3 different statements in different parts of the abstract. We got one way up at the top saying in the phase 1 project, this is our priority, then we're going to do this. And then serological assays for antibodies, so we're going to be making antibodies down here. So basically the problem with this abstract is that the parts are disjointed. And the reviewer doesn't have this nice storyline to follow through of, significance, problem, solution, action plan. So when you're writing, you've got to think, are you creating this nice storyline, or do you have things being, put helter-skelter into different parts of your application? That's a lack of smoothness. And what happened here, this application did not get funded. This, I guess, was the older scoring system. And the reviewers said, on the positive side, the investigators have the expertise, et cetera. But of concern, they came up with a significant concern in the approach section. Project is original, innovative. They liked that. But not a lot of innovation because immunoassay is standard in the industry. So they didn't buy into innovation. They didn't buy into the approach. And likewise, there were some significant some significant gaps in the approach. No contacts have been made with a company to make the polyclonal and monoclonal antibodies. So if you're going to if your approach depends upon a vital reagent, you have to have that reagent. You can't say we're going to go off looking for it once we get the money. So if it's something like an antibody that you might have to generate by immunizing a rabbit, you have to have done that by the time you apply, because otherwise the reviewers will say, well, why should we believe that you can do it? And in this case, where apparently this was proposed here to buy it from another company, well, no company was indicated. So reviewers said, they haven't thought through this. They haven't figured out where they're going to get it, and there's no budget to support it. Little enthusiasm for the approach since no experimental design is described. So clearly there wasn't enough detail in the experimental design, to say this is how it can be done. No description of experimental approach is provided. The fact that others have worked for years in the same approach dampens enthusiasm. So apparently applicants did not say, well, even though others have not succeeded, this is why we will succeed. So these are the things that went into that led to a negative conclusion by these reviewers. Reagents needed for the assay have not yet been generated. That's what I just mentioned. Basically, this was a failure. Enthusiasm is damped by the use of this, and so the approach is what killed this. The fact that something was proposed as an approach which wasn't supported by reality. Not enough preliminary data because it was never mentioned here. And apparently the applicants didn't say, here's how we will get these reagents. So reviewers said, it looks like they just haven't thought it through. And we've just gone over that. So what Olympic sport is grant scoring most like? I watched the Olympics. I don't know if you did. There were parts of it which were more or less interesting. So how about these sports? Hockey, figure skating, speed skating, and curling. Who says hockey? Any takers for figure skating? At least 2, 3, 4, 5. Speed skating? Got 1. Curling? I didn't know what curling was before watching the Olympics. Still not sure I know what it is. Actually, maybe I know what it is. I'm not sure why it is. I don't know what the point is. Anyway, here's my answer. Figure skating. And figure skating because A, it's not measured quantitatively. Even though they award points, there's all this style and all that. Whoops. Stop this. Secondly, there are lots of nuances. It's very subjective. Thirdly, reviewers take deductions for everything that's not perfect. In other words, you're starting with a perfect score, and then they're saying, well, this was deducted for this reason, et cetera. And then the judges are anonymous, which, again, if you're speed skating, it's just the judge is the clock. So, a whole different story. But this is what we're up against. We're up against something which is basically a subjective review process. in which points are deducted for things that you're not always in control of. And that makes it more challenging. So the science of grant review, most scientists regard this new streamlined peer review process as quite an improvement. And that's sort of what it feels like as you're going through it. I just wanted to mention briefly that, question of who reviews your grants. Well, this was a study section for SBIR grants that I guess one of our grants went to. And you got 18 academics and 10 industry. The academics are in yellow, the industry are in pink here. So the probability that your reviewer is an academic is 64% in the study section. What does that mean? It may be good or bad, but in many cases, in our experience that academics tend to have broader scientific knowledge base, but less understanding of product development and commercialization. So, if you want someone who's going to understand your science better, maybe that's the academic. But if you're trying to say why your product is going to be successful, that person might not understand that as well. And so, on the whole, I'd say academics, having the review panel stacked in favor of academics is not always a good thing. There are some limitations. The industry people can contribute a lot of expertise in terms of being able to say, yes, from a commercial point of view, what they've written in the commercialization plan makes sense. We've been there, we've done that, et cetera. So you have those two sides sometimes not exactly in sync with each other, but on the whole, most of the reviewers seem to be academic, and they tend not to be as qualified, let's say, to understand everything about SBIR grants as we sometimes would like. What does a grant review look like? This is typically the scenario. It's a hotel ballroom, a subterranean hotel ballroom in a cheap hotel in suburban Washington, D.C. with not very good air conditioning, and you're there all day. So, you've got people sitting there all day, and the way it works out is first, the reviews have been done in writing. There have been 3 reviews done for each grant in writing. And then they have this process called streamlining, where the bottom 2/3 of grants in terms of quality are just thrown out immediately. So basically, the logic is once we got all these reviewers in the room and they've got exactly 8 hours or whatever it is, 9 hours, 8 hours, we don't want them having to review all 300 grants that were submitted in this round. So we'll just take the top third, and who cares about the rest? So they have the beginning of the meeting focus on voting on rejecting all the bottom 2/3. And so unless some reviewer is willing to step forward and say, I think this really should be discussed, those grants will just be not reviewed by oral discussion. You'll eventually get a written critique, and that's it.
Sorry, one question. So, given that, is normalization of scoring across reviewers an issue, or some reviewers may review to a different standard than others?
Yes, it's a big problem. The question was normalization between reviews. Is there consistency in how reviewers score between different reviewers? The answer is no. It's a big problem. NIH has been trying to deal with it, not very successfully, and that's one of the things that introduces a lot of variability into the reviews. That question we could talk about. But basically, the remaining grants get about 15 to 20 minutes each of verbal discussion, and what happens is you get the first, second, and third reviewers leading the review. You get group discussion. Then they go for a vote. The full panel of maybe 15 or 20 reviewers around the table here votes. They all score, that is, they score numerically what they want to score, and they turn it in. And then the final score is the average of the individual scores. And so how this works in a little more detail, the first reviewer prevents the overview and critique for about 5 minutes. The second reviewer presents only points where his or her opinion differs from the first reviewer, and the third reviewer presents only opinions that are different from the first 2. So they try to triage it that way. And that means that in general, the first reviewer is the one who sets the overall tone of the review. And it's unlikely, let's say, that a negative first reviewer impression can be overcome by a second or third reviewer. It can happen. If you have a second or third reviewer who's really wants to be a champion of the grant, and they can lay out the reasons why the first reviewer is wrong. But because the first reviewer has the full 5 minutes or whatever and has the floor first, it's more often than not their review that sets the stage for how the grant is going to be perceived by the whole panel. So for the most part, you need to convince the primary reviewer, who will then convince the rest of the panel. And that means that you're writing primarily for an audience of one. And that's a scary thought, but that's the reality. And so the result is that the scoring result is proportional to reviewer, the competency of the one person who is the primary reviewer, and that's somewhat luck of the draw. And again, that's why if you can convince the NIH to try to find competent reviewers in your field, that can hopefully increase the chances that you'll get a fair review and not someone who doesn't understand what they're looking at, which has happened. And just to discuss briefly the scoring system so that you understand again what you're up against, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 criteria that are scored numerically in a review. And then there are these 4 that are scored as acceptable or not acceptable. And the numerical scores range from 1 to 9. And these 2 tables come from NIH. So this score shows 1 as being exceptional and 9 as being poor, which is an understatement. And the overall impact score, which is what is used to determine funding or not funding, is not calculated arithmetically from the individual criterion scores, not these, but represents the reviewer's overall impression. So in other words, the reviewers are scoring the significance as 2.3, innovation 3.5, whatever. But those are not used to generate some arithmetic transformation for the overall impact score. The overall impact score is whatever the reviewer wants it to be. And that's the score that determines the final score, which determines funding. The overall impact is what they report on the final report with all reviewers' scores summarized and then averaged. And the reason why that's significant is that all you really care about is their overall impact score in the end. So these other scores, their only point is to help influence the reviewer's overall impact score. So again, whether you have a particularly hot topic in terms of significance, that might not be the key driver. You just have to figure out what it is that's going to lead to the best overall impact score and what's going to prevent that from being dinged. So the impact score decides the funding in most cases based on the agency pay line. I'm not going to go into pay lines here. There's a lot of information on the web on agency pay lines, but they're determined based upon how much money Congress gives NIH and each individual agency. You have a question?
What's environment?
Environment. That's the scientific environment you're working in. So it's let's say if you're in a laboratory environment, you've got this laboratory around you, and you would say facilities, resources. I have access to the following in the department of whatever made available for this project. I've also acquired the following equipment. So it's both tangible and intangible. Some of it is, we have a department or whatever, or a dedicated group of investigators who have expertise in this field. So you try to combine that into showing what the resource. Yeah.
Speaking to the expertise of the reviewers, is just the 3 who are actually reading your application the ones who might be tailored to your expertise, and the whole group is very varied, or is the whole group tailored to what the pile that they're looking at?
The way this works, the question again was, does the review panel, the whole study section, how is it matched to the expertise needed for your grant? Is it only the 3 reviewers who have to have that expertise, or what? And it's a bit of a mix and match issue in that the subject matter is divided up into multiple study sections. So if you have a grant, let's say in our field, let's say diagnostics for infectious agents, that goes into a study section which is aimed in general at either diagnostics or infectious pathogens or something like that. So it's not going to deal with regenerative medicine. That's going to be a whole different study section. Within this one study section, the administrator of the study section will try to find individuals with expertise addressing every grant that is being reviewed. And so, of course, they only have 20 or so people, and they have to cover who knows how many grants, 100, 300, whatever. So the expertise, as I said earlier, it's going to vary. Sometimes it might be dead on, and sometimes it really might be pretty far off.
Follow on to that, so is one day in the dingy basement, that's one study section? That's a full solicitation for April 5th,
Yes.
yes? So there's multiple study sections in
Right.
that basement?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they usually they rent the hotel for a couple days, and it's the usual deal where they have all the little ballrooms on the subterranean floor, and each room is a separate study section meeting more or less in parallel. And so one study section processes 300 grants or whatever, which the first 200 is thrown out. And so you know where you stand. They have this nice little curve. Again, the impact scores range from 1 to 9, and they have this little graphic strengths versus weaknesses. And so, NIH in its anal compulsive way has divided things into what they consider high impact applications with scores of 1, 2, or 3, and those divide between exceptional, outstanding, and just excellent. And moderate impact is 4, 5, and 6. Which divides between very good, good, and satisfactory, and low impact. 7, 8, 9 is fair, marginal, or poor. And so that's one way of categorizing them. Then they have another table with, again, the same number scheme, and they've given some additional detail, like, number 5, good, strong with at least one moderate weakness. Number 6, some strengths, but also some moderate weaknesses. So what is a moderate weakness? A moderate weakness defined as a weakness that lessens the impact of the project, whereas a major weakness, a weakness that severely limits the impact of the project. So the reviewers have to sort of work their way through these criteria in trying to score the grants. And again, you, the applicant, are not necessarily in control of their thinking, but hoping to tailor the grant to meet their expectations to optimize your score. But what you end up with, is an impact score, on this chart somewhere. And so the reality is that if you have an impact score of 1, you will be funded. That's the way it works because there are so few people who end up with a score of 1 or 1.1 or 1.5 or anything like that. And that's exceptional. Exceptionally strong with essentially no weaknesses. If you have a score of 2, that's still outstanding. I'll take that, extremely strong with negligible weaknesses. So that's very likely to be funded. That tends to be a question of whether the exact score, if it was a 2.3, is it within the current pay line, or is NIH going to wait until they have more money? Again, like figure skating, I watch figure skating. So when you see the first figure skater appear and the judges give him or her a whatever score, 5.0 or something, and the commentators say, well, this was really great performance, but they're holding back because they think somebody better is going to come along later and they need a reserve of points for that person. So same with NIH. They award the top grants early in the year, in the funding year, which starts in September. So something with a score of 1 going to be funded right away. But if your score is somewhere up in the 2s or 3s or whatever, somewhere closer to the pay line, they often will say, well, funding is going to be contingent upon our budget situation, and sometimes they push those off to the end of the fiscal year, and they'll tell you for months and months, you're still in the running, but we just don't know what our funding is going to look like by the end of the year, so hang in there. And sometimes it's August when they find that they have a little bit of money left that they didn't spend earlier in the year, And that's their money to award to grants that they wanted to fund, but they weren't sure earlier could be funded. So many of these are in this sort of category likely to be funded. A 3 has an excellent, very strong, with only minor weaknesses. Well, the reality is only marginal chance it'll be funded if it's a 3. And then you get into 4. Very good, strong, but with numerous minor weaknesses. That's enough to kill it. Probably not. And this whole category, grants in the strong, some strengths, etc., down to poor, very few strengths. These are all basically DOA, because they have enough grants that are going to score up in the 1 and 2 range, so they never have to dip into this level here of grants, 4 and under. So the reality is that the cutoff for fundable grants is somewhere in the 2 to 3 range. 3 generally not funded, 2's often funded.
Are you, is it okay if you are applying for an NIH SBIR, but also like what you're doing is going to qualify for a DoD SBIR? Does it hurt you, help you, disqualify you?
It doesn't disqualify you. You have to report on the application that you're applying for federal support from another agency, so they know officially, because if you got support from one agency, the other agency is not going to be able to fund exactly the same thing, much as you might like that. And of course, the way that people often do it is the grantsmanship game, where if you can submit parallel applications which overlap but not completely, then you can go back. If you're lucky enough to get both funded, you can go back and renegotiate what's going to be funded by one agency versus another. That often can be workable. So our little review process here is sort of like Monopoly. You have the peer review by the study section. If that passes, you end up with an advisory council meeting reviewing the grants that were in the funding range. And that meeting is typically held several months after the initial peer review, sometimes only a month, sometimes 3 months. And that's really the meeting that determines whether something is good to go, whether NIH is saying, yes, this will be funded. If so, it goes through administrative review, which is where all these sticky issues come up, like did you check the right boxes on your human subjects section so that we know you're doing the right things with people, et cetera. And they check over those things very carefully. Once that's done, then the money is not far away, a couple-week turnaround often. And then reverse process, if you didn't get through the peer review section too well, you can revise your grant and you can resubmit it. And that's where you would go from there. Just wanted to show you the mailroom at NIH on a grant receipt deadline, and you're one of many. So they really do get thousands and thousands of applications on these days. And I just wanted to show you also, since I try to play tennis, most tennis matches involve cross-court rallies because risk of losing a point cross-court is relatively low while you're in a position to win the point eventually. So the people who eventually win are the guys who are good at maintaining relatively low risk in their shots. And so what does this mean to somebody who's stuck writing an application? Well, you're playing sort of a similar game. What you're trying to do is stay in the game, not stick your neck out to the point where it'll get lopped off, but stay in the game so that you're proposing something which is solid, not necessarily a high risk, high reward kind of grant, which could get kicked out because they consider it too risky, but something that has something that they can buy into. And sometimes that's contrary to what a lot of people think. A lot of people think that, well, NIH should be supporting, the most high-risk, far-out science, but that's just not the tradition that they followed. They want to do it in many ways. There are a lot of people at NIH who want to support high risk of ventures, but it's very difficult for them to turn the Titanic around and change the way they've been doing things for years. So the reality is that the greater chance of success is probably by being a little more traditional in avoiding what would be a truly high-risk scenario and making, pitching your grant to be very solid, but having innovative elements. And I looked at that as sort of a Scylla versus Charybdis kind of venture, where again, this is what I just said, that NIH has these typical phrases. This is a high-risk project which would be valuable if it succeeds. So the if could be a very big if for them. The high level of risk is of concern. You know that they don't want to buy into it. Score drivers. I think given the time, I'm going to try to wrap up soon here. But I just wanted to leave you with a little bit more here. That there have been some rather careful analyses, which are all online, and I've got all these websites here. But what people have done is to look at the correlation between the overall impact score, which determines where the grant ends up versus the funding pay line, and the individual criterion scores. And I told you that the overall impact score is not calculated arithmetically from these individual scores. So what is it based on, or what does it correlate to? Well, it turns out it correlates most strongly with the approach, and then after that, the significance. And so in other words, what that's saying is that, and I've got, someone did this throughout all the NIH agencies, and they found the same thing, that basically the approach and then the significance are the two factors which determine whether the grant is going to get a high impact score or a low impact score. So what that's saying, again, is you have to show that your approach is sound, that your experiments or whatever can be done with a high chance of success. You've got all the pieces working, you can put them all together, you've got measures of success or failure along the way. You've got preliminary data which support the validity of your approach, show it's feasible, that you've taken as much of the risk out of it as possible up front. That's what they want to see, and that convinces them that it's a doable project. And they'd rather fund something which is doable but maybe a little less exciting versus something that's very exciting but just doesn't look like it's doable. And that's the reality of what you have to sell to them, that your project is doable. Now, hopefully everyone's project is very exciting, but again, because they look at all these applications which have significant sections that say this is very important, they're going to go down to the approach section and they're going to say, well, of all these applications which are all aimed at very, very important objectives, which of these are actually likely to succeed? Which of them can be done by these people with these resources? So that's where this approach section comes in, and that's why a lot of effort should be spent on making it very solid. And I just took some quotes again from people who've commented in these online discussions about NIH grants, that strong correlation between impact and approach shows the reality. A flawed approach can sink a great idea. If the approach has problems, the proposal is doomed, et cetera, et cetera. Reviewers continue to find the approach criteria the most useful, so we're left with the approach. So basically, this is sort of the message that I'd like to give you, that you should spend enough time on the approach section of an application so that the reader, after reading it, really believes that it can be done. That with whatever you're going to do with your resources, et cetera, very high probability of success, as opposed to we think we can do it. Now, if your application does not pass review, because this is going to happen most of the time, the reality is, don't bother trying to contest fairness of the review. Life is not fair. Get used to it. NIH does not really have a mechanism to contest the fairness of a review. And I've asked them that question because I've had unfair reviews which were just blatantly unfair. And the answer is always the same. We commiserate with you and just resubmit it. And so that's what you have to do. Most of us are not perfect, and most applications are not perfect. And now you have one shot at resubmission. They pulled back from their original 2 shots to 1 shot. I think that's really a crime, but unfortunately it's not my call. So you have to make that resubmission as strong as you possibly can get. And to do that, you've got to read the critiques very, very carefully. They will give you written critiques for grants that are not going to pass. It helps to speak to the program officer and ask whether they have any input they can give you on how to make it stronger in resubmission. Sometimes the program officer was at the review session and heard what people said and can sort of interpret it for you. And I like to tell people, this is not an individual battle, this is a war. You're in it for the long term. You're not just submitting one application, presumably. This is probably one of a series that you're going to go for, and you're really looking at a portfolio which is going to result in some level of funded applications, which is probably not going to be 100%. For me, it's definitely not 100%. So you really need to be thinking not of, I missed this one, life is over, et cetera, but rather, how can we just build on what we've done to eventually get funded grants and hopefully, a high percentage of funded grants. So what you have to do is prepare well in advance for a resubmission, which is going to be on a subsequent submission due date. You have a one-page introduction, which you have to submit. And that introduction has to show what is different about your new application versus the original one. And that's your chance to summarize what the original reviewers said, and either why it wasn't wrong, why it was off target, why it wasn't right, why it was flawed, and one way or the other, how you have compensated for it. And that may be very simple. We didn't have preliminary data then, we do now. Here it is. But you have to be able to respond very specifically to those critiques in the one-page introduction. And then you may also have time to provide additional data, because in many cases they look at it and say, well, the data are really not strong enough. But you're going to have perhaps a couple months before the resubmission, and you don't want to lose that time. So our working model is we just keep on working on the project so that we can build up more data, and then in the resubmission we can say, we actually have a stronger case now than we did originally. I wanted to mention that in the phase 1 to phase 2, what you want out of phase 1 in most cases is to go on to phase 2. Phase 2 is more funding available, right? And it gives you more time, more resources to do what you need to do. So for phase 1 to phase 2, you want to be able to show at the end of the phase 1 grant that you have a single defined product or service for a single market. You're very focused, mainly that you've taken the scientific risk out of phase 1 so that phase 2 becomes much lower risk. And when you write a phase 2 application, there's more money involved, and by that time you really want that money because hopefully you're far along in product development and you're at the point where that phase 2 grant is going to be what makes it or breaks it. And so you want to make the case that the scientific risk has now been taken out of the project overall, and phase 2 is all about just execution. So you have in the phase 2 application more of an execution strategy than a basic science strategy. You also have alternative paths so that you've, again, reduced risk in case one thing doesn't work, you've got other options. And you don't want to say, well, we developed this product in phase 1, but now we're going to do something totally different in phase 2. They tend not to like that. They want to make sure that whatever you've done in phase 1 is the building block for phase 2, so there's continuity and there isn't a new risk element. Second to last slide, I think, in terms of what happens if you're in a phase 1 grant. These grants normally last 6 months. You can extend them sometimes. You can get a no-cost extension for a year typically, and that's often not a bad idea for 2 reasons. One is that you need to apply for phase 2 with the results of phase 1, and before you get phase 2, you may be waiting for months, if not a year or more, with no funding, called the Valley of Death. So in order to avoid that scenario, if you can extend your phase 1 grant period through, say, a whole year, you can get to the point where sometime during that year you can be in a position to apply for phase 2, and then you will minimize the downside risk of a Valley of Death period where your phase 1 is over and you have no phase 2 funding yet. So that's that. Resources, I wanted to mention that, yes, there are zillions of web pages. NIH has a series of web pages, some of which are more useful than others. But things you might stumble across yourselves anyway, the NIH Reporter website is a searchable database of all the SBIR grants that have been awarded, and not just SBIR, but other grants. So that if you wanted to find out what other people have done that has been supported by a grant award in your area, you can do that through this site. You can see what your competitors have got funded. It's very useful. Solicitations are all published on FedBizOp's website, both for contracts and all sorts of other NIH solicitations. That's intended for applicants. For applicants who are busily writing a grant, the electronic forms and instructions are all online, of course, but SF 424 and PHS 398, those are the key instructions that you will need to know very, very well by the time you go through this whole process. And then there's a book which I found, which I thought was really pretty good. Well, one of the zillions of books, but How the NIH Can Help Get You Funded, which has a lot of solid information, which is much more extensive than what I've told you here. And there, I think I'll sort of end later than usual, so I appreciate your patience. But I sort of look at the grant pursuit as a hobbit voyage. You're in a strange land. They speak a different language. There are a lot of perils en route, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of gold when you finally get there in the end, if you get there. So thank you very much. I'm going to stay here. I'll be happy to talk with anyone.